Ever looked at your paycheck and wondered where it all goes? Like money comes in and somehow money goes out, and you're left wondering if you're doing this whole saving thing right, or if you're just spectacularly bad at adulting. You know that moment when you realize it's already the 20th of the month and you have no idea where half your money went? You definitely spent it on something, but ask yourself to list out the purchases and you'd be totally stumped. Well, here's something that might surprise you. Most financial experts will tell you to save 10%, maybe 15%. Some will say 20% if you're trying to be aggressive. But the actual data on what people are saving is shocking. And once you understand what the real numbers look like, you're going to realize that most people are basically broke in slow motion. They're not technically poor, but they're also not building wealth. They're stuck in this middle zone where they feel financially okay month to month, but they're on a trajectory towards serious problems in 30 or 40 years. My name is Alex, and I spend way too much time analyzing personal finance data, so you don't have to. If you want to understand exactly how much of your paycheck you should be saving and what the actual percentage looks like for people at different income levels, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it ends up making you feel either motivated or terrified about your current saving situation. Because honestly, depending on where you fall on this spectrum, it could go either way. Now, before we jump into the specific numbers, let me ask you something. What percentage of your paycheck do you think you're supposed to save? And I mean, actually save, not just move to a different account and then spend it 3 weeks later. Most people give an answer between 5% and 20%. Some ambitious folks will say 30% or higher. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. The answer completely depends on where you are financially, what your income level is, and whether you're asking what you should be saving or what people are actually saving. Because those are two completely different numbers, and understanding the gap between them is basically understanding why so many people never build wealth. The gap is absolutely massive. And when I say massive, I mean it's literally the difference between retiring at 60 and working until you're 70. It's the difference between having options in life and feeling trapped. It's the difference between building generational wealth and living paycheck to paycheck. Most people don't realize just how much that gap matters until they're in their 50s or 60s and they look back and realize they made all the wrong decisions in their 30s and 40s. By then, it's too late to really fix it. You can't compress 30 years of compound growth into 5 years no matter how hard you try. Let me start with what the research actually shows about savings rates across different income levels. The median American household saves roughly 3.5% to 4% of their income. 3.5%. That means more than half of all households are saving less than that, which is truly terrifying when you think about it. These people are earning income, paying bills, and basically treading water financially. They're not drowning yet, but they're definitely not swimming anywhere. They're like someone who's treading water and telling themselves they're fine. Meanwhile, they've been treading water for 40 years straight, and their arms are getting tired. At the bottom 25% of income earners, the savings rate actually goes negative in some cases. These households are spending more than they earn, which means they're going into debt just to maintain their current lifestyle. They're not even treading water. They're sinking and getting used to it. They're taking on credit card debt and personal loans and car payments just to live the lifestyle they think they deserve. It's a wealth destruction machine disguised as a normal life. Moving up to the bottom 50% of earners, savings rates hover around 2% to 3%. So they're saving something, which is technically better than going negative, but it's not exactly a path to financial security. Let me put this in perspective. At a 2% savings rate, someone earning $50,000 is saving $1,000 per year, which is about $83 per month. That's less than a decent weekly meal delivery service. At this income level, any unexpected expense is still a potential disaster. A car repair, medical bill, job loss. These aren't minor inconveniences, they're financial emergencies that can unravel everything. One emergency wipes out the entire year's savings instantly. When you move into the top 50% of earners, savings rates start creeping up to around 8% to 10%. Now we're getting somewhere. These households are actually saving enough to build an emergency fund and maybe start thinking about retirement. They're not comfortable yet, but they're definitely moving in the right direction. Someone earning $70,000 at an 8% savings rate is putting away $5,600 per year, which is real money. That's enough to build a 3 to 6 month emergency fund over a couple of years, assuming they're not spending every dollar on everything else. The top 25% of earners are saving closer to 15% to 20% of their income. This is where financial security starts to feel like something more than a distant dream. These households can cover unexpected expenses without disaster, they're building retirement savings, and they might actually have investments working for them. A household earning $150,000 at a 15% savings rate is saving $22,500 per year. Now we're talking about serious wealth building potential. At that pace, they'll have a 6-month emergency fund in less than a year, and they can start thinking about retirement savings, investment accounts, and maybe even buying rental property. The top 10% are saving 25% to 30% or higher. At this level, saving is almost automatic. They're not sweating whether they can afford to save because their lifestyle is built around the concept of saving being non-negotiable. It's just what they do. Money comes in, a chunk goes to savings automatically before they even think about it, and they live on what's left. The psychology is completely different. And here's where it gets interesting. When you look at the top 1%, their savings rates aren't necessarily dramatically higher in terms of percentage. But because their income is so much larger, the actual dollar amounts are shocking. A top 1% earner saving 25% is saving more in a single month than most people save in an entire year. Like someone earning $750,000 annually and saving 25% is putting away $187,500 per year. That's more than the total income of most American households, and it's just the savings portion. But here's what's fascinating about these numbers. The percentage that you should save isn't actually a fixed number. It's way more complicated than that. Some people need to save 50% of their income just to reach financial independence by retirement age. Others, especially high earners, could theoretically save 15% and still be fine. And some people, especially lower income earners, literally cannot save 20% without their quality of life becoming unbearable. The whole idea of a universal savings rate is kind of a myth. What matters more than the percentage is whether you're saving something and whether that something is consistently directed toward wealth building goals instead of just sitting in a regular savings account earning basically nothing. I know people who save 30% of their income in a regular savings account earning 0.01% interest, and they think they're crushing it financially. But they're actually going backwards in real terms because inflation is eating away the purchasing power of that money faster than they're accumulating it. Meanwhile, I know other people who save 8% but invest it properly and they're on track to become millionaires. The number matters less than what you do with the number. Let me break down what the data shows when you start looking at specific income levels and what percentage makes sense. For someone earning $30,000 per year, saving 20% of their income would be $6,000 annually. That's a lot of money when your total income is only $30,000. It would require serious lifestyle adjustments, and honestly might not be realistic without additional income sources. You'd be living on $24,000 per year, which is pretty tight in most parts of the country. A savings rate of 10% to 15% is probably more realistic, which is $3,000 to $4,500 per year. That's still meaningful progress toward building an emergency fund and eventually investing. Over 10 years, even at 10%, that person would have $30,000 plus investment returns. For someone earning $60,000 per year, that same 20% savings rate works out to $12,000 annually. That's more manageable because it's proportionally smaller relative to the total income, even though it's the same dollar amount as our $30,000 earner. You're living on $48,000, which is tight but doable in many areas. At $100,000 per year, 20% becomes $20,000 saved annually. Now we're talking about real wealth building potential. You're living on $80,000, which is pretty comfortable for most people in most areas. And at $200,000 per year, 20% is $40,000 per year, which could be aggressive depending on location and family situation, but is definitely achievable for most households at this income level. If you're making $200,000 and spending $160,000, you're living a nice lifestyle by most standards, but you're also on a trajectory to build serious wealth. Here's where the psychology gets interesting, though. Most people think about the savings rate in terms of whether they can afford it. Can I afford to save 20% of my income? But the real question they should be asking is whether they can afford not to. The math on this is actually pretty brutal when you run it out over decades. Someone saving 10% of their $50,000 income for 30 years will have accumulated over $200,000 plus investment returns, assuming modest 7% annual growth. Someone saving 20% of the same income over the same period will have accumulated over $400,000. The difference between saving 10% and 20% over a 3-decade career is roughly $200,000 in buying power. That's not just a number on a spreadsheet. That's the difference between retiring at 65 and retiring at 55. That's the difference between leaving your kids an inheritance and leaving them your debts. That's the difference between experiencing financial anxiety throughout your entire life and actually sleeping at night. And here's what makes it even worse. The person who saved 10% probably felt like they were being disciplined. They probably told themselves they were doing great. They probably compared themselves to the 3% savers and felt superior. But in 30 years, they'll have half the wealth of the person who saved 20%. They made a different choice earlier in life, and that choice compounded into a dramatically different outcome. This is why the savings rate decision is so critical. It's not about being perfect. It's about making the right percentage choice and then sticking with it for decades. But here's what makes this even more complicated. The income you're earning right now isn't static. It's going to change. Most people have periods where they earn more and periods where they earn less. And your savings rate in those higher earning years absolutely matters. If you get a $10,000 raise and you immediately boost your lifestyle by $10,000, nothing changes. You're still saving the same percentage. You're on the same trajectory. But if you get a $10,000 raise and you keep your lifestyle the same, suddenly you've just increased your savings rate by 10%, 15%, or maybe 20%, depending on your current income. Over a 20-year career with multiple raises, the person who keeps their lifestyle the same will accumulate multiple times more wealth than the person whose lifestyle inflates with every raise. This is called lifestyle consistency, and it's probably the single biggest predictor of whether someone will build significant wealth. The people who get raises and don't immediately upgrade everything in their life will accumulate wealth. The people who get raises and immediately increase their spending will stay broke forever, regardless of how much they earn. They'll be stuck on a hedonic treadmill where they're constantly earning more but never ahead. I've seen people making 6 figures with zero net worth because they upgraded their housing, their car, their everything every time they got a raise. And I've seen people making $50,000 with $500,000 net worth because they refuse to let their lifestyle inflate with their income. Let me give you some context for what these different savings rates actually mean in terms of lifestyle. When you're saving 3% to 5%, you're living right at the edge of your means. Maybe a little below, maybe a little above, depending on the specific month. There's no real financial cushion. You're trying to have a normal life, go to restaurants sometimes, take a vacation every couple of years, and basically enjoy the income you're earning, while still technically saving something. But that something is so small that it barely matters. You're saving for maybe 3 months of financial security if you lose your job, and that's only if you don't use any of those savings for emergencies in the meantime. Most people at this savings rate are spending on credit cards or going backwards slowly. The financial stress is constant. Every paycheck is an event. You're not sleeping well. You're probably snapping at people you love because you're always stressed about money. And the worst part is you're not building anything. You're on a treadmill going nowhere. When you bump that up to 10%, you're making a conscious decision to reduce your lifestyle slightly. Maybe you're eating out less frequently. Maybe you're planning more affordable vacations. Maybe you're being more intentional about discretionary purchases. But you're still living a pretty comfortable life. You can still do things that make you happy. You're just being intentional about it instead of defaulting to whatever makes you feel good in the moment. You've made a conscious choice to save something meaningful, and you can actually feel the difference at the end of the month. At 15% to 20%, you're making significant lifestyle trade-offs. You're prioritizing your future over your present in a measurable way. You probably feel it in your daily decisions. You're thinking about purchases more carefully. You're saying no to things you want. You're probably feeling some financial pressure because you're genuinely sacrificing present comfort for future security. But here's what's interesting. Most people at this level, once they get used to it, actually start feeling better about money. The stress of not knowing where their money went decreases. The knowledge that they're building something gives them mental peace. And at 25% to 30%, You're basically living well below your means. You're making conscious, intentional decisions about almost every purchase. You're probably driving a reliable used car instead of upgrading to something new every few years. You're probably renting a modest apartment instead of stretching for a bigger house or a fancy neighborhood. You're probably cooking at home most nights instead of eating out multiple times per week. You've probably cut entertainment and discretionary spending significantly. But here's the interesting part. Most people who actually hit a 25% to 30% savings rate don't feel deprived. They actually feel more secure, which is why the psychological shift is so important. The knowledge that you have control over your money, that you're building something, that you're on a path to something, it's more satisfying than the temporary pleasure of spending money on stuff you don't need. When you start saving a meaningful percentage of your income, you're not just accumulating money. You're developing an identity as someone who saves. And that identity shift completely changes how you relate to money and financial decisions. People who see themselves as savers make different choices than people who see themselves as spenders. They think differently about purchases. They plan differently for the future. They feel differently about their lives. The person who saves 20% is a different version of themselves than the person who saves 3%. They're not just different in their bank balance. They're different psychologically. They have different confidence levels, different stress levels, different vision for their future. The research on savings rates and financial security is actually pretty clear. People need to be saving something closer to 15% to 20% of their income if they want to retire at a normal retirement age and have a comfortable lifestyle. Less than that, and you're looking at either working longer or having a less comfortable retirement. More than that, and you're accelerating your timeline to financial independence. But the harsh reality is that most people are saving well below 15%. They're saving 3% to 5%, which is roughly 1/4 of what they actually need. This creates what I call the slow motion broke phenomenon. They're employed. They're earning income. They're not living on the streets. But they're on a trajectory toward a financial crisis. They just don't realize it yet because the crisis is 20 or 30 years away. It's like watching someone drive toward a cliff in slow motion. From their perspective today, nothing is wrong. They're on the road. They're moving along. They have a paycheck coming in. They're paying their bills. Everything feels fine. But in another 20 years, when retirement age arrives and they don't have enough saved, suddenly the cliff appears. And by then, it's way too late to change trajectory. They can't compress 20 years of compound growth into 5 years. They can't suddenly triple their savings rate when they're 60 years old and expect to retire at 65. The decision about whether to save 5% or 15% today is a decision about their quality of life at 70. And most people don't think about it that way. The question becomes, how do you actually increase your savings rate if you're starting from 3% or 5% or somewhere in that below average range? The instinct is usually to just cut spending, which technically works, but it's also incredibly difficult to sustain. If you've built your life around a certain level of spending, cutting 10% to 15% of your budget feels like deprivation. You're eating less, driving less, doing less, and it feels like punishment. Most people can sustain this for a few months before they burn out and go back to their old spending patterns. They feel deprived, they feel like they're missing out on life, and they abandon ship. The more effective approach is to actually increase your income. And I know that sounds harder, but it's often easier to increase income than to cut spending in a sustainable way. This could mean asking for a raise, taking on a side hustle, freelancing with your skills, starting a small business, or developing income-generating skills that could eventually lead to better employment. When you increase income instead of just cutting spending, you're not feeling like you're depriving yourself. You're feeling like you're making progress. And you can redirect that new income towards savings without feeling the pain of lifestyle reduction. The person who gets a $5,000 raise and saves all of it feels like they're gaining, not losing. The other approach is what I call the hybrid method. You cut spending a little, say 5%, and you increase income a little, also maybe 5%, and suddenly your savings rate has jumped 10 percentage points without either change feeling overwhelming. You're moderately cutting spending and moderately increasing income, and both together create meaningful momentum. Neither change feels like punishment. Together, they create significant movement toward your financial goals. But here's something that most financial advice misses. Your savings rate is only half of the equation. The other half is what you're doing with the money you're saving. If you're saving 20% of your income, but you're putting it in a savings account earning 0.01% interest while inflation eats away 3% of the value per year. You're actually getting poorer in real terms. You're saving money and losing wealth simultaneously, which is even worse than not saving at all, because at least with not saving, you're not fooling yourself about your financial progress. You think you're ahead, but you're actually behind. The money you save needs to be invested. It needs to be working for you. It needs to be generating returns that are greater than inflation and greater than what you could earn just sitting on it. For most people, a simple diversified portfolio of index funds is the right move. It's boring, it's simple, it doesn't require you to be a stock-picking genius, and it works. Over long periods of time, well-diversified index portfolios return around 8% to 10% annually. That's more than enough to build real wealth if you're consistently saving and investing over decades. The difference between saving 15% and putting it in a savings account versus putting it in an index fund is absolutely massive over time. We're talking about the difference between $300,000 and $700,000 after 30 years with the same savings rate. That's not a small difference. That's a life-changing difference, and here's what makes this even more frustrating. Most people don't realize this. They save in a regular savings account, earning nothing. They feel like they're being responsible, they feel like they're doing well, but they're actually losing wealth to inflation every single year. It's one of the cruelest tricks of personal finance. You can be doing everything right behaviorally, saving consistently every month, and still be going backwards financially because you're saving in the wrong vehicle. Here's something else that the data shows that most people don't realize. Once you hit a certain savings rate, usually around 20% to 25%, something magical happens. And I mean this literally. Something shifts in your psychology and your perception of reality. You start noticing opportunities everywhere. Side hustles become possible because you have a financial cushion. Better jobs become possible because you're not desperate and you can actually be selective. Investments become possible because you have capital to deploy. Your relationship with money fundamentally shifts from scarcity to abundance, even though your total income hasn't actually changed much. You're just putting more of it away instead of spending it. And because you're putting more away, you have more optionality in your life. You can take risks that broke people can't take. You can invest in yourself by taking courses or certifications. You can leave bad situations. You can negotiate from strength instead of desperation. A person with a $25,000 emergency fund has options that a person with a $2,000 emergency fund just doesn't have. And that fundamentally changes the trajectory of your life. The person with options makes better decisions. The person without options makes desperate decisions. So the question really isn't whether you can afford to save 15% to 20% of your income. The question is whether you can afford not to. Because the alternative is working until you're 70, hoping that Social Security is still solvent, and basically never having the freedom that financial security actually provides. You'll be working because you have to, not because you want to. You'll be stuck. The shocking data on savings rates shows that most people are way behind where they need to be. They're saving 3% to 5% when they should be saving 15% to 25%. That gap is the difference between building wealth and staying broke. It's not a small difference. It's not a marginal difference. It's a massive life-altering difference, the difference between retiring at 60 and retiring at 70. The difference between leaving your kids an inheritance and leaving them debt. The difference between financial autonomy and financial desperation. Once you understand that, the only question left is what are you actually going to do about it? Are you going to stay at your current savings rate and accept whatever financial future that trajectory creates? Or are you going to make the decision to prioritize your future self over your present impulses? Because that decision, made today, will compound into either tremendous security or tremendous regret. And the thing that makes this so crazy is that most people don't actually need to earn a lot more money to solve this problem. They just need to save a bigger percentage of what they're already earning. That's it. That's the whole secret. It's not complicated. It's not mysterious. It's just a decision about priorities and then the discipline to stick with that decision every single month, every single paycheck for decades. You get your paycheck, you automatically move a percentage to savings and investments before you can spend it, and then you live on what's left. Most people do the reverse. They spend what they want and then save what's left, which turns out to be basically nothing. Flip the order around and suddenly your entire financial future changes. The data is shocking, but the solution is simple. Start saving a bigger percentage of your paycheck today, even if it's just 5% more than you're currently saving, even if it's small. Get the ball rolling, build the habit, develop the identity of someone who saves, and let compound interest do the rest. Your future self will thank you for the decision you make right now, and you won't believe how much that simple decision compounds over 30 or 40 years of consistency. The person you become while building the habit of saving is infinitely more valuable than the money itself. And that transformation, that shift in identity and psychology, it ripples through every single area of your life in ways you probably can't even imagine yet. So make the decision today, not tomorrow, not next month. Today, your future is worth it.